Hello, everybody, and good evening. Hope you're enjoying these hot summer days. Thanks so much for taking time tonight to be here for this really fun event. My name is Nick Neely. I'm an assistant professor of English writing at Eastern Oregon University. Welcome to this reading and conversation, which is co-sponsored by the nonprofit LiteraryArts, featuring 3 of the 2021 Oregon Book Award winners, Nicholas Buccola, Vanessa Veselka, and Sierra Crane Murdoch. We're going to pause just a moment to allow for people to reclaim their seats or refresh their drink, and then we'll get going. Come back to your screens. Thanks for your patience. We'll get going now. I wanted to begin tonight's event with just a brief land acknowledgement, since a number of us are in La Grande, where Eastern Oregon University is sited. We humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. And now I'm pleased to turn it over for a few minutes to Jessica Meza-Torres, who's going to say a few words about literary arts. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Nick. I'm Jessica. I'm with Literary Arts. I want to thank Nick Neely and the Ars Poetica reading series for hosting us, and I'm so delighted to be here with 3 of the 2021 Oregon Book Award winners. The Oregon Book Awards is a program of Literary Arts. Literary Arts is a community-based nonprofit arts organization, and our mission is to engage readers, support writers, and inspire the next generation with great literature. The Oregon Book Awards are presented every year for some of the finest writing by Oregon's authors. Out-of-state judges select the finalists and winners in each genre. The 2021 Oregon Book Award winners were announced on May 2nd, 2021 on a special episode of the Archive Project. And guidelines for next year's Oregon Book Awards will go online later this month. And you can find more about our work and more about the Oregon Book Awards by visiting our website at www.literary-arts.org. Now I'll hand it over back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica, and our sincere thanks to Literary Arts for proposing and helping to arrange this great reading. Each of our authors is going to read for about 15 minutes, and then at the end, we'll take your questions. So as they crop up, reading by reading, please drop those into the Q&A box at the edge of the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll field those. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Now it is my pleasure to first introduce Nicholas Buccola. Nicholas is a writer, lecturer, and teacher who specializes in the area of American political thought. His first book is The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass in Pursuit of American Liberty from New York University Press. He is also the editor of the essential Douglass Writings and Speeches and of Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy. He is the Elizabeth and Morris Glicksman Chair in Political Science at Linfield University in McMinnville. At Linfield, he teaches courses in political theory and public law, coordinates the major in law, rights, and justice, and is the founding director of the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice. He serves as the book review editor of American Political Thought from the University of Chicago Press. His essays have appeared in scholarly journals, including the Review of Politics and American Political Thought, as well as popular outlets such as the New York Times, Salon, the Baltimore Sun, and Dissent. He is most recently the author of The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and The Debate Over Race in America from Princeton University Press, which is the winner of the Francis Fuller Victor Award for General Nonfiction from the Oregon Book Awards. He lives in Portland. Please welcome Nicholas.
Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate that introduction, and I'm so honored to be here tonight with all of you. I love literary arts. I love this Ars Poetica series. It's really special for me to be honored this year with the Oregon Book Award. This book, The Fire is Upon Us, is really about the power of language. I often tell people before the pandemic, when I was out on the road, often I'd find myself surrounded by books when I was talking about this book in bookstores and libraries. And I always would remind people that James Baldwin really says that libraries saved his life. And I think that's really true, that the books were always central to his finding meaning in the world and connecting with people across time and space. And so it's just such an honor to be with a group of people who love language and believe in the power of words to change the world. So I'm so honored to be here with all of you and with my fellow awardees this year. It's really, really great. I just want to set up a couple of little excerpts from The Fire is Upon Us that I'll read to you. The book itself, the hook for the book is this 1965 debate that occurred between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. At the Cambridge Union, the world's oldest debating society. Buckley and Baldwin were invited to debate the motion, "The American Dream is at the expense of the American Negro," and that debate was February 18th, 1965, really the high tide of the civil rights revolution in a lot of ways, right in the midst of the Selma campaign. And Baldwin and Buckley, these two internationally known figures who were in some ways the sort of respected poets of movements. They were leading writers associated with the civil rights and conservative movements, respectively, are invited to this international stage to square off. It's kind of an intellectual heavyweight fight, if you will. And that scene itself is amazing, dramatic. There's a BBC recording of it on YouTube. Millions of people have now watched that. I recommend everybody check it out. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is really a little bit of the setup for that big moment. The debate itself constitutes two climactic chapters in The Fire is Upon Us, but really the heart of the book, as far as I'm concerned, is the backstory. And when I set out to write a book about the debate and realized pretty quickly once I really got into the research that the backstory, that these two lives, these two individuals who were born only about 15 months apart from each other, really the story of who they were, how they became who they were, why they thought what they thought. That backstory is really where the heart of this book is. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. And the first excerpt I'm going to read is from 1957, which is a really important year in the story. It's actually the year, as a writer, when I realized, I had something, in terms of the story was so powerful in so many ways, but it was the 1957 moment when I remember sitting with a friend at 10 Barrel Brewery and saying, this is really amazing. I hope I don't screw this up. And the moment itself is set up in this way. I do this really deep dive in the book into Buckley and his circle in 1957. He's got this conservative magazine, National Review. It's right in the sort of like the magazine is founded right alongside these major moments in the Civil Rights Revolution, the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision, the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, the lynching of Emmett Till. All that stuff is happening right in the time when Buckley is founding his magazine. And his magazine takes out a position that is absolutely, positively suspicious to hostile to the Civil Rights Revolution. So just to give you a sense of where they end up, they are critics at almost every turn of Martin Luther King. They are critics of the Freedom Riders. They're critics of the sit-in protests. They're against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They're against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I do this really deep dive into that world and try to understand how these guys justify their position. And after about 20 pages of that, more than just about any reader wants, I then transition to Baldwin. And it's in this moment, Buckley writes his most infamous editorial, segregationist editorial, Why the South Must Prevail, in the late summer of 1957. And it's right then, in the late summer of 1957, with James Baldwin, who had left the US in 1948, had spent most of his time in Paris for 9 years, returns in 1957 to make his first trip to the American South, to bear witness to the revolution. And so it's in this moment where, I'm juxtaposing Buckley and his world of resistance to Black liberation with Baldwin making this journey, his first journey to the American South. And so I'm just going to read you a little bit from that part of the book. At the very time when Buckley and his colleagues were debating the finer points of just how far the Southern resistance ought to go, Baldwin was staring into the eyes of a 15-year-old boy who was among the first Black students to attend a recently integrated high school in North Carolina. Baldwin made his way to this young man's living room on assignment to write pieces on the racial situation in the South for Harper's and Partisan Review. Baldwin was taken with the boy's very large eyes, which not only spoke, but registered volumes. Baldwin's preoccupation with the eyes of his subjects has great significance. The eyes speak in many ways, but perhaps most important, they hold the key to intersubjective understanding. Baldwin's quest was to get as close as he could to seeing the world through the eyes of his characters, fictional and non-fictional. And his primary goal as a writer was to provide his reader with a chance to do the same. What had this boy's very large eyes seen lately? Baldwin learned that G, as he called him in the piece to protect his anonymity, had been subjected to name-calling, threatening phone calls, and human barricades meant to keep him out of school. As Baldwin listened to this nightmare, he began to wonder how G managed to face what surely was the worst moment of his day, the morning, when he opened his eyes and realized that it was all to be gone through again. G proved to be rather taciturn about how all this made him feel, and Baldwin began to suspect that this was because his mother, Mrs. R, was present for the interview. It was his mother, after all, who had been one of only a few dozen parents in a city with a Black population of 50,000, who had even submitted an application for the school integration program. She had, in a sense, sent him marching toward that white barricade. As Baldwin reflected on the precarious situation into which Mrs. R had thrust G, he wondered what prompted her to take this audacious step. Perhaps because Baldwin helped raise his younger siblings, he was the oldest of nine children, had been long drawn to and haunted by what the world must look like through the eyes of a Black parent. In Notes of a Native Son, one of Baldwin's early essays, he had described looking around the church at his father's funeral and pondering the impossibility every parent in that room faced. How to prepare the child for the day when the child would be despised, and how to create in the child, by what means, a stronger antidote to this poison than one had found for oneself. Mrs. R was one such parent, and when she was presented with the chance to get G out of the failed institution that was his former school, she could not refuse. "My boy's a good boy," she told Baldwin, "and I wanted to see him have a chance." After speaking with G and his mother, Baldwin's next stop was a visit with the principal of G's new school, a young white Southerner who seemed to Baldwin to be bewildered and in trouble. What interested Baldwin was not so much this man's views of the merits of Brown v. Board or his thoughts on the details of North Carolina's pupil assignment integration program, but rather what it was like for him to play what was undoubtedly a difficult role in the drama that was developing in the South. After some back and forth, it became clear that although integration was simply contrary to everything he'd ever seen or believed, he had no hatred or ill will toward Black people, and most important, felt he had a job to do. Furthermore, he told Baldwin, race relations in this city were excellent and had not been strained by recent developments. Baldwin took this man at his word. He was no virulent racist or arch segregationist. Instead, he was the sort of Southern moderate whose role in the maintenance of Jim Crow regime had been passive and almost robotic. Only now, then I talk about this earlier moment when Baldwin describes in 1955 when he encountered a kind of robotic racism in New Jersey, and in that moment he was so enraged by it he threw glass at this waitress in a restaurant and had this sort of this moment of great rage. So I say here, in a sense, the principal's racial attitudes were reminiscent of the waitress in New Jersey who had so enraged Baldwin a decade earlier. Only now the more mature Baldwin was able to manage what he called the fever. Instead of throwing something at the principal or storming out of the room, he found himself rather liking the man and wanting to understand him. The principal struck him as gentle and even honorable, but also delusional. He, along with so many others, not only in the South, but in the entire country, had deluded himself into denying the life, the aspirations, the universal humanity hidden behind the dark skin, and by so doing stayed insulated from any pangs of conscience that might force a painful re-examination of his entire sense of reality. Perhaps the most powerful moment of the interview occurred toward its end, when Baldwin looked into the principal's eyes and said, "It must be very hard for you to face a child and treat him unjustly because of something for which he is no more responsible than you are." In the anguish, pain, and bewilderment that filled the man's eyes at that moment, Baldwin caught a glimpse of the impossibility, a term he invoked again here, that so haunted those parents in Harlem. So that's the moment that I thought I would share with you. My timer didn't work for me, Nick, but I think I've probably got about a minute left. Is that right, Nick?
Absolutely. Take
Okay.
your time.
Yeah. So I turned on my timer, but it failed me. So just to give you just a brief sense on the Buckley side of the story, I thought it'd be fair and balanced and give Buckley a minute here. One of the moments for me that was most powerful and important was thinking about how Buckley's views evolved. So as I mentioned, in 1957, he writes this infamous editorial that's by all descriptions white supremacist, in a white supremacist defense of segregation, in this piece called "Why the South Must Prevail," where he argues that the white South is entitled to dominate politically so long as they are, quote unquote, the advanced race. That's a quote from the piece. Watching Buckley evolve from that position in the late 50s through this sort of time in which he debates Baldwin in 1965. And one of the things I found to be most powerful when I did this really deep dive and thought in slow motion with William F. Buckley about these matters is how he evolved over time. And in particular, in the months leading up to the debate at Cambridge, Buckley is really embracing a position that I think contemporary readers find to be quite familiar. And so I'll just read you just a paragraph from a section about that. Buckley, right before the 1964 election, so which famously pitted conservative Barry Goldwater, one of Buckley's political heroes, against Lyndon Johnson. In the lead up to the election, Buckley knows that Goldwater is going to lose. Everyone knows that Goldwater is going to lose and probably lose big. And so Buckley commissions a special report on the race issue and the campaign for his magazine National Review. And he has a series of articles commissioned for that particular edition of National Review. And what he does, it's really, I think, important for us to see, is that Goldwater had been accused of being racist for voting against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. His supporters were being accused of being racist and fascist. But Buckley commissions this special report on race and has almost nothing written in this special report about civil rights issues in the South. Instead, the entire special report is focused on elsewhere in the country, right? The South had been won; it had become Goldwater country. And so Buckley has a piece, that's about the quote unquote white backlash by sort of suburban whites and working class white ethnic voters who were turning against the Democratic Party. He has a piece about busing in New York and how white suburban parents are going to revolt against busing. He has a piece about fair housing law in California. And so what I say in the book is that pivot, right? It's not, Buckley is not all to blame for this pivot in American racial politics, but he's certainly a champion of a particular view. So I'll just read this last paragraph and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues. Here's the paragraph. There's one more thing worth noting about what Buckley chose not to include in his special report. In the wake of charge after charge that Goldwater and the conservative movement were racist, the special report seemed to present Buckley with an opportune moment to exercise his power as the keeper of the tablets for the conservative movement. As we think back on Buckley's role as editor of conservatism, several key moments stand out, such as commissioning Whittaker Chambers and Gary Wills to write Ayn Rand out of the movement, or his own series of essays attempting to purge Robert Welch and then the entire John Birch Society from the ranks of the respectable right. Yet on the question of race, we search in vain for that moment when Buckley stood up and offered an unequivocal rejection of racist politics. Privately, he had been willing to write back to racist readers who complained he was too soft when he discussing innate racial differences or too hard on the Ku Klux Klan. But he refused to go public to offer a forceful and unequivocal repudiation of racist elements in the right wing. Perhaps this is because he already knew what the rest of the country would soon discover, that the racist right was now an indispensable part of the conservative coalition. Thanks so much for your attention. I look forward to the other readings and to our conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. Really exciting moment to hear about Baldwin's visit and his take on this principle. And it sounds like an incredibly timely book. Can't wait to read it. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Vanessa Veselka. Vanessa is the author of the novel Zazen, which won the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her short stories have appeared in Tin House and Ziziva, and her nonfiction in GQ, The Atlantic, Smithsonian, The Atavist, and in the Best American Essay series in the anthology Bitch Fest, 10 Years of Cultural Criticism. She has been at various times a teenage runaway, a sex worker, a union organizer, an independent record label owner, a train hopper, a waitress, and a mother. She lives in Portland. Her latest novel, The Great Offshore Grounds, published by Knopf, was longlisted for the 2020 National Book Award and is the 2021 winner of the Ken KESEY Award for Fiction from the Oregon Book Awards. Please welcome Vanessa.
Hi there, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to read some sections, and it was great to hear what was read and what was spoken before. You know, everything I write is basically about the American project and whether it works. You know, I find that I come to that question again and again, and this book is no different. So I'm going to jump around a little bit and 15 miles south of Seattle and halfway across Puget Sound to the west is Maury Island, shaped like an arrowhead aimed at the mainland, green as the inner fold of a grass blade. It can be seen from the air, cradled in a crook of an elbow of water. Tourists ride over on ferries to watch for whales and UFOs. Jets turn around overhead on their final approach to the airport. Even on days when there is no rain, mist filters through the evergreens until it pulls apart like threadbare cloth and burns off. The wedding was to be held in the afternoon at Point Robinson, the site of an old fog signal station that once housed a steam whistle fed by coal fire and water to warn away ships. In 1897, at the dawn of massive capital speculation and expansion, the whistle sounded for 528 hours, nearly killing the man who had to shovel the 35 tons of coal. The cargo had to be kept from the rocks, and who could halt the lumbering desires of the world? In 1915, the lighthouse with its state-of-the-art fifth-order Fresnel lens was built. Powered initially by oil vapor lamps, its beacon could be seen for 12 miles. The lens was the perfect manifestation of Victorian technology, replacing simple flat lenses with faceted crystal domes, prisms cut into tiers that made it both astonishingly beautiful and a breakthrough in optics. The Fresnel lens had theoretically infinite capacity to capture diffuse light and, by way of internal reflection, cast it like a spear through darkness. It lit stages in celluloid, Polaroid shots, and retinas for ID scans. And on Point Robinson, it lit the Puget Sound. Back across the Sound in Seattle, Livy stood out, looking out of the window of her basement apartment. Her father was getting married that afternoon, and though it was already late April, a cold, wet breeze still whistled through the gaps in the caulking, turning her skin to goose flesh. A few feet away stood her sister Cheyenne, poorly slept but already dressed. "I'm freezing," said Cheyenne. "I'm turning on the space heater." "Turn on the oven. They charge us for electricity," said Livy. Cheyenne rolled her eyes but went over to the little white gas stove. Cranking the temperature to broil, she leaned back against the oven door so she could feel the heat on her hamstrings while the oven warmed. Yesterday, they'd spent the whole day picking rocks out of Livy's landlord's garden in trade for a patch of soil near the sunny side of the fence so that Livy could grow food. It wasn't political. Livy didn't care about pesticides or permaculture. She was just the cheapest person that Cheyenne had ever known. She lived off past date groceries. She washed her clothes once a month with a teaspoon of dish soap in a tub. She made her own bras. Cheyenne was pretty sure she would have rinsed and reused dental dams if she thought it would work. Recently, though, Livy had become convinced that she could feed herself off 3 square yards of land. It was ridiculous, but since Cheyenne had appeared out of nowhere and moved in on her without warning or rent, she didn't have much of a say. Taller and unfreckled, Cheyenne had chosen a rose-colored cap-sleeve shirt with eyelets and a pair of black pinstripe suit pants. She could pass in the crowd that they would be in today. Her secondhand clothes would come off as vintage. while her misadventures in body art would make her seem a fine vase, badly cracked and chipping, but a gritty accent to any room. Cyril didn't come to my wedding, Cheyenne said. Why should I go to his? Did you invite him? Hell no, he would have arrived like a lord and expected to walk me down the aisle. Hey, here, let me give you away. Oh, Dad, I think you already did that. Yeah, you're right, he would have, said Livy. So why are we even going? I have the day off work and it's cheaper than a movie. I'm tired of ramen and hot dogs and there'll be rich people food, so I'm taking Tupperware. Don't make it obvious, said Cheyenne. We're already going to look so out of place. Oh, why? Because you have jailhouse tats of hearts and clubs on your knuckles? Or because I don't shave and look like a landscaper? Cheyenne spread her fingers of her left hand. Not just clubs and hearts. The one on my thumb is a diamond and the pinky is a spade. You just can't tell anymore. Livy crossed to where she'd laid out her newly washed painter's pants and pulled them on over her long johns. I'm going to the wedding because it's a show of support that costs me nothing. I've never thought of him as a dad. I don't care. At his worst, he's a big blank. He's a disappointment. He gets a clean slate. That's my wedding gift to him, a pass. It's the only decent move. I shot my better angels, said Cheyenne. They're angels. You can't kill them, said Livy. Yes, but if you were real, they could. You could. Neither sister had seen their father since they were 14. The wedding invitation had arrived only 2 weeks before the date of the ceremony, just on the heels of Cheyenne's reappearance, something their mother Kirsten considered prophetic. It was obvious from the short window that the decision to include them was at best the result of a long debate, or at worst, an afterthought. Their initial instinct had been to ignore it, and the invitation was repurposed as a coaster for days before it was seriously considered. But in the end, they could not ignore it. It tapped at a hidden door. Shh, he is a king in a castle. He has only stashed us away in the village to keep us safe. Someday he will call for us, claim us, and make everything right. As kids, they had been given the fairy tale version. 2 women loved the same man. One wanted a baby, and the other wanted to chase the North Star. Each became pregnant, so they made a plan. The one who wanted the baby, you know what? I skipped something that was essential, and that's all right, because I'm going to go on to something else. So there's 2 sisters that are at the heart of the novel. They're 33 when this starts, and they got nothing, and their families got nothing. And they go to see their dad, and what they get is the name of a woman who may or may not have been one of their mothers. And so it starts off a road trip for them to try to find this other woman, and the mother they do know, Kirsten. I'm going to read a section about her as well. So, Kirsten, nocturnal as she was, rarely woke before 4 p.m., and if she did, it was for administrative reasons. DMV lines, unpayable bills, courthouses, and community college. She preferred these things to come at her half asleep so she could protect the best part of herself for later, because at night, she had a shining diamond mind. She had come home from meeting with Livy and begun to work through her list of chores, since she was already awake, but then stopped in the middle. She was anxious and hadn't known it. The day had a haze to it, and it felt like a future memory, each moment framed like she wasn't there, but looking back at it already. It was a natural step from that feeling to the realization of what was bothering her. Anne, that's the name of the other mother. Beneath her visible frustration with Cyril's violation, him handing the name over to the daughter, and how it might throw her daughters off course, was something that she could not name. It was an undertow. She pulled out the box from the closet. Beneath 10 years of 1040 EZs, she found her earliest journals and brought them into the kitchen table. On top was her first. It had a denim cover with a gnome on it, and carved in the side, it said, "Food is evil, sleep is for losers." She had written it when she was back starving herself, living on Pop-Tarts cut into tiny squares. It was written the summer before she met Margaret, a public health nurse and a midwife from Boston. 15-year-old Kirsten had walked into the Planned Parenthood looking for birth control. Too skinny, stripping her black hair to frost it blonde, worried that the pill would make her fat, frustrated about slipping diaphragms, creeped out totally by the sponge, sick of condoms, she demanded that Margaret give her something better, as if it were the nurse's fault. Margaret started listing all the options, but Kirsten did not like what she was hearing. "This sucks. she said, jumping off the examining table. No wonder people just pull out. What do you call people who use the withdrawal method? Asked Margaret. Kirsten glowered. Parents. No, heterosexual, said Margaret. Kirsten looked at her, but Margaret remained straight-faced. Fuck, I wish I was gay, said Kirsten. Well, if you're dead set against condoms, you could try cervical cap. No protection against STDs, but it works pretty well if you do it right. It's smaller than a diaphragm. Most women are just too chicken to touch themselves and would rather poison their bodies, but you're not chicken, are you? Kirsten tried to figure out if it was more pathetic to be proved a coward or to get goaded into something because someone calls you one. She pulled her pants off and lay back on the table while Margaret measured her cervix. Pulling the small latex cup out of a box, she showed Kirsten how to get it up and slide it in and get the suction rate. We'll have to order the cap. It'll take a few weeks. On the way out, Margaret grabbed some granola bars from a basket in a break room and shoved them into Kirsten's hands. The man wants you too thin to think, too thin to act. Never give the man what he wants. It's hard to overestimate the impact of meeting someone who is truly free. Pre-Margaret, Kirsten felt flat. Everything was washed in pastel, the hideous institutional color palette of the day. Baby blue, peach, coral, salmon, pale aqua, taupe. After Margaret, everything began to change. Over the next few appointments, she worked on Kirsten like a fucking glorious unicorn of feminism. She came at Kirsten with everything she had, and in one summer, she freed Kirsten from nearly every cultural bind, a radical form of rare magic. And I'm going to read, let's see, one more quick section, or two more short sections. I'm going to read a section from a trip as they're traveling. A few hours past Missoula, the land changed again, flattening and turning brown and scoured by the wind. They crossed the Yellowstone River, then followed it as it ran north by northeast, fed by the Yellowstone Lake. It had poured over the falls and through the Black Canyon before they ever knew it. Past Billings and the Yellowstone joined the Bighorn, which carried with it the Little Bighorn and the Tongue. As they drove, they saw signs of reenactments. Custer, stand with or against, your choice. And they heard the talk of the rest of the area, a magnificent new state-of-the-art jail created from nothing but investor money and high-interest loans. Then they came to the Great Powder River, which was fed by the Little Powder, as well as oil from pipeline breaks, Red Cloud's War, and the benzene benzene as it joined the Yellowstone, which had already inherited so much, the Bighorn, the wind and the Tongue, as it flowed towards the Missouri River, which had no choice but to inherit the watershed as it drained towards the Mississippi, that unstoppable force. And maybe there just is no way out of history. Maybe no matter how much you want to come from a different story, you can't. They traveled from high elevations and scrubland to prairie to chain stores and settled in the doldrums of flat grass, sunburnt and feral, another unwelcome thing on the land. After Miles City, they dropped south through the hunting grounds of the Crow people. In the periphery, Livy saw a new figure, free again. Cheyenne saw a woman with a changing face, now this, now that, the mother narcotic. Maybe a different story would mean a different future? Maybe there was another history to claim. Passing through the Black Hills, north of Mount Rushmore and Pine Ridge, south of the Bakken Formation and Standing Rock, they drove the Badlands. East of the coal beds, west of the Black Hills, they passed a rash of square and Sputnik-era buildings, each half as tall as the flagpoles in front of them. An elementary school, a middle school, a high school, decorated with signs leading to bomb shelters, furnished with government-issued desks made out of moonshots and school bells cocked like a gun for lunch periods and air raids. They passed the white chalky pits of bentonite clay, terraformed by bulldozers, missing only the great hand of a giant three-year-old descending from the heavens. There were ripples in the land, and the sun was a patina on the highway. Tangled spaghetti creeks glinted, and irrigated farms lined one beside another like jade mahjong tiles. Livy looked through the windshield as she drove at the grassland steppe on either side. They could hear the subsonic songs of red rock and scrub brush. In an unsparing flash of midday light, they drove through the miles of cash crop ethanol, a pentimento of buffalo skins behind it, untanned and rotting in piles on the prairie. They too were shadows. Driving to the sea here, drive to the sea there, raise a great army from Nantucket to the Arctic to Panama, growing in all directions, a deep breath. They drove across the great American desert, an empty, lifeless wasteland. It stretched from the Midwest to the Rockies and served as an initiation for pioneers and speculators seeking the spoils of the West. Only the desert was not lifeless, and it was not empty. It was not the Kalahari or the Gobi, but a prairie overrun with life. And overrun with life, covering a great aquifer from which grain, future dust bowls, and the Monroe Doctrine would be drawn. Wagons brought whale oil to new towns, oil for light and lubrication, bones for corsets and collar stays, ivory for the keys of Midwest parlor pianos. Girls stretched their hands over the white keys, dreaming of marriage, future typists, future salaried masses, secretaries, tapping out notes, imagining still a world made of whale teeth and rib cages, brown fat and ambergris. Was this where it had all gone wrong? Livy saw a man in the arid expanse, flickering in and out of existence, preening in an Elizabethan ruff with a fistful of charters, bent down to check the soil for tobacco. Finding it too dry to plant, he strode forth, oscillating over the steppe to the golden salt and light rumored to be in the hills to the west. She watched him vanish into a pinprick in the rearview mirror, a small white star degenerating towards collapse. So that's all I got.
Thanks, Vanessa. This is incredible. So lyrical, so sweeping. And I was struck by how much history you've tucked into this novel from even this small glimpse. It's apparent. So maybe we could talk about
yeah, there's a lot of history.
Yeah.
The character at the very end that gets introduced is actually Walter Raleigh, but yes, we can tell you.
Oh, cool. Thank you. That was great. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our third reader for tonight, Sierra Crane Murdoch. Sierra, in fact, joined us in May for a reading for the Ars Poetica Spring Series, and we're so glad to have her back tonight. She's a journalist and essayist whose work concerns primarily communities in the American West. She's reported on the oil boom in North Dakota and its impact on the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation since 2011. Her writing has appeared in American Life and in Harper's, Virginia Quarterly Review, The New Yorker Online, Orion, The Atlantic, and High Country News, where she was a staff writer and a contributing editor. She received a Middlebury Fellowship in Environmental Journalism, an 11th Hour Food and Farming Fellowship, a visiting fellowship in the Investigative Reporting Program at the University of California, Berkeley, and a McDowell Fellowship. She lives in Hood River. Her first book, Yellow Bird, Oil, Murder, and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country, was just last week named a finalist for the 2021 Pulitzer Prize. It was also named one of the best books of 2020 by the New York Times, NPR, Amazon, and Publishers Weekly, and was nominated for the Edgar Award. And of course, it won the Sarah Winnemucca Award in Creative Nonfiction from the Oregon Book Awards. It's my pleasure to introduce Sierra.
Thanks for that introduction, Nick. So it's such an honor to be here with Nicholas and Vanessa. Your books sound incredible, and I can't wait to read them. Vanessa's reading was especially vivid for me because the last territory she wrote about, the landscape south of Miles City and east of Miles City and the Badlands and the Bakken oil fields, is where my book takes place. So my book is Yellow Bird, Oil, Murder, and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country. And it began actually when I was a staff writer for a magazine that Nick mentioned that actually both of us worked at, High Country News in Colorado. And my first assignment for the magazine was to go up to the Bakken oil fields and to write about a tribal nation, the Mandan Hidatsa Rikra Nation, that was situated right in the center of the boom and potentially was going to produce up to a third of the oil coming out of North Dakota. So I went to report on this pretty remarkable moment in this tribe and was interested in just what people thought of it and what was going to come of it. Over the following years, I kept going back to write other stories. And eventually I heard about the crime, which became the centerpiece of my book, which is the disappearance of a young white oil worker from the reservation, Christopher Clark, who went missing from his workplace in 2012. And I went back to investigate, and in the process of reporting that story, which I thought would just be a magazine story, I came across a woman, Lissa Yellowbird, who just immediately struck me as the most fascinating person I'd met. She had been searching the Badlands of North Dakota for the body of Christopher Clark. And she had involved herself really intimately in this case to a degree that I think most people didn't realize. And I didn't realize it until she invited me to Fargo to visit her. And she was working as a welder at the time. And she would leave and she would just open up her computer in the morning to me, and she would allow me to just sift through her hard drive and download whatever documents I wanted. And it was through that, through sifting through tens of thousands of pages of text messages that she had exchanged with people she believed were involved in this crime, that I began to piece together this story and began to realize that she was very critical in breaking open the case. But I didn't come at this story because I was interested in writing a true crime. It wasn't a genre I was particularly drawn to, or a genre that I had written in before. I was interested in this story because I thought that crime might be a new window into this transformation that the oil boom had brought to the reservation that I had been witnessing over the past few years. But I didn't think it was very interesting to see that boom just purely through my eyes. I thought seeing that boom through Lissa's eyes might be really interesting. She had gotten out of prison in 2009. She had come home to her reservation and found it in this state of radical flux. And so she had both like an insider's perspective on the boom and an outsider's perspective, being from the reservation, but then also being someone who was returning after some time away. And also her backstory was really fascinating. She'd been a drug dealer. She was in recovery for addiction, and so her attraction to this to solving this crime had a lot to do with kind of, as her daughter said, replacing one addiction for another. So Lissa is really the centerpiece of this book, and I thought I would just begin by actually reading from the beginning. And not quite the beginning, but the first chapter, just to give you a sense of this book's protagonist. This chapter is called The Brightest Yellowbird. Lissa Yellowbird could not explain why she went looking for Christopher Clark. The first time I asked her the question, she paused as if I had caught her by surprise, and then she said, "I guess I never really thought about it before." For someone so insatiably curious about the world, she is remarkably uncurious about herself. She is less interested in why she has done something than in the fact of having done it. Once, she asked me in reply if the answer even mattered. People tended to wonder all kinds of things about her. Why did she have 5 children with 5 different men? Why had she become an addict and then a drug dealer when she was capable of anything else? Lissa stands 5 feet and 4 inches tall, moon-faced and strong-shouldered, a belly protruding over hard, slender legs. Her teeth are white and perfectly straight. Her hair is lush and dark. She has a long nose, full lips, and brows that arch like crescents above her eyes. When I met Lissa, she was 46 years old and looked about her age, though given the manner in which she lives, one might expect her to look older. She has a habit of going days without sleep, of sleeping upright in chairs. She rarely cooks, subsisting largely on avocados, tuna, croissants, mangoes, and candied nuts, and smokes like a fish takes water into its gills. She often loses things, particularly her lighters. One night, I watched as Lissa searched for one, nearly gutting her kitchen, until she gave up, bent over the countertop, and lit her cigarette with the toaster. She is a member of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikra Nation, an assembly of 3 affiliated tribes who once farmed the bottomlands of the Missouri River and now call a patch of upland prairie in western North Dakota their home. The Fort Berthold Indian Reservation is 3 times the area of Los Angeles. The tribe has more than 16,000 members. Like a majority of these members, Lissa has not lived on Fort Berthold in some time, but she keeps in her possession an official document establishing her tribal citizenship. Arikra blood quantum, 23/64. Mandan blood quantum, 1/4. Hidatsa blood quantum, 3/16. Sioux Standing Rock blood quantum, 1/8. Total quantum this tribe, 51/64. Total quantum all tribes, 59/64. What's the other 5/64? I once asked. I don't know, Lissa replied, but somebody fucked up. It was a joke. As far as she knew, at least 2 fathers of her children were white, and if anyone had fucked up her blood quantum, Lissa thought, it was the United States government. The fractions were controversial and arbitrary, assigned to her great-grandparents in the 1930s by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to determine how many individuals belonged to the tribe and how much federal assistance the tribe thus deserved. One could be a whole Indian, a fraction of an Indian, or no Indian. The idea was that a person's Indianness could be defined solely by race. It was the Bureau's way of applying order to the mess it had made, though to Lissa, the fractions had always seemed superficial. In reality, she believed there was no clear order to her life. She had worked as a prison guard, bartender, stripper, sex worker, advocate in tribal court, carpenter, bondsman, laundry attendant, and welder. She studied corrections and law enforcement at the University of North Dakota, where she graduated from the criminal justice program, though rather than working for the police, she spent much of her adult life evading them. She was arrested 6 times, charged twice for possessing meth with intent to deliver, and given 2 concurrent prison sentences, 10 and 5 years, 2 of which she served. When Christopher Clark went missing in 2012, Lissa was on parole. Her interest in his disappearance may have seemed misplaced, were it not for the fact that it made as much sense as every other random interest she had taken in her lifetime. Lissa was born on June 13, 1968, to Irene Yellowbird and Leroy Chase, both members of the MHA Nation. Leroy had joined the Air Force and was not present for her birth, nor was he present for the rest of her life, except on a rare phone call. Irene's mother, Madeline, was Catholic, and since Irene was 21 and unmarried, arranged for a relative to take Lissa. The arrangement lasted 7 months before Irene, swayed by the new radicalism of the era, decided she would not be shamed into giving up her daughter and asked for Lissa back. It was her mother whom Lissa would later blame for the patternlessness of her life, her mother's ambition to be exact. After they reunited, Irene dedicated herself to academic pursuits. They left North Dakota for California, where Irene enrolled again in school, then returned to North Dakota, then left for Wisconsin, where Irene pursued another degree before returning again to North Dakota, where she served for a while as the only Native American professor in the state. The longest Lissa and her mother remained anywhere was 3 years, when they lived in Bismarck, a few hours south of the reservation. They moved to the city in 1972, when Lissa was 4 years old, into an apartment with a single bedroom where Lissa kept a pet fish. One day, the fish died, and Irene flushed it down the toilet. Lissa could not forgive her mother for this. It seemed unfair to her that something living, which she had loved, should end up in the sewer. Her sensitivity exasperated Irene, who supposed her daughter had wanted a full burial with a procession and drums and star quilts draped over a casket. She supposed her daughter even wanted a priest. Lissa had acquired certain habits in church, such as fashioning bowls out of paper and placing them around the apartment. Alms for the poor, she called when anyone came to visit. Sometimes the visitors were her mother's white, wealthier friends, but often they were family. Alms for the poor, she called nonetheless, shaking her bowls piously, until one day her mother had enough and scolded, "Lissa, we are the poor." Lissa had always been like this, Irene later told me, a fanatic with a bleeding heart, giving weight to weightless things. I supposed it was a kind way of explaining her daughter's passionate tendencies, since Shauna, Lissa's own daughter, explained them to me differently. "My mom is an addict," Shauna said. She meant this in the broadest sense. Shauna is the oldest of her mother's 5 children, only 19 years younger than Lissa, a generational closeness that pressed her up against her mother's faults and made her feel them more acutely than her siblings. When Lissa started smoking crack, Shauna was 8 years old. 6 years later, Lissa turned to meth. But even in the years before she got high, Lissa, Shauna believed, had been prone to obsession. Among the first of these obsessions Shauna recalled were plants. When she was in preschool, her mother had discovered an interest in growing things, and after that they kept all kinds of plants, leafy, tropical, sun-starved plants, spilling from the windows of their apartment in Grand Forks, where Lissa attended college, as well as trays of vegetable starts Lissa grew from seed, though they never had any space for a garden. After that, her mother's obsessions came in all forms, sudden and indiscriminate, but each one Lissa had taken on with the faith and focus of a zealot. For a while, it had been music. Lissa taught herself to play piano before she purchased a camera and became an ardent documentarian. If these obsessions sounded like hobbies, Shauna insisted they were not. It had never been enough for her mother to take an interest in something. Rather, Lissa was set on being the best at everything she did. The best drug dealer, the most dogged bondswoman, the eventual leader of each organization she joined. After Lissa emerged from prison sober, she still found plenty of things to obsess about, and in fact, it seemed that sobriety intensified her fixations. According to Shauna, the only difference between the things that occupied her mother when she was sober and the things that made her high was that Lissa often abandoned the sober things with the same swiftness and ease with which they came to her. In one of their many moves, they had left the plants behind. This was one thing Shauna expected as a child, that whatever life they were living at one moment would only last so long. Always they had kept moving, from hotels to shelters, from apartments they rented to the houses of friends, and from the papery walls of all the places they lived, her mother had hatched, again and again, changed and yet the same. And so when Lissa first told Shauna about the oil worker who was missing and how she planned on finding him, Shauna assumed this obsession would also pass. She thought it would last weeks or months until the young man was found. She did not think it would go on for years. I don't know what it was about that boy, Shauna would say, but Christopher Clark was different. So a lot of the book is divided into two sections, boom and bust. And later on in the book, I decided, because I'm white, I'm not Native, I decided that, and also because Lissa is someone who really conscripts the people around her into her story, and it's really hard to separate yourself from her. I decided that it would be most honest for me to be in the story, to sort of make clear to my readers, who's choosing what to put in, who's choosing what to leave out, that this isn't entirely an objective experience peering in on her life. And I spent a lot of time in the process of writing this book, walking with Lissa through the Badlands of North Dakota, and just sort of like registering the landscape as we were searching together for KESEY Clark's body. So I'm just going to read, just to end, like a very, very brief section from one of the chapters in which I'm following Lissa around in the Badlands. Just find it real quick. Lissa told me that to find a body in the Badlands, I would have to know the landscape in all seasons. I should be there when the snow melted in April, and when the heavy rain in May carved rivulets into the gumbo and washed sediment into the channels that cut around the buttes. I should see the cottonwoods bud in the late spring, and in the summertime, watch the cockleburs grow thick in the coulees. The foliage would not last long, Lissa said. By late summer, the brush would turn brittle, so that a cigarette flicked out a car window might cause it to burn for days. In the fall, the rain would come again, and this too I should see, how the bentonite clay would glisten like whale skin, evening its own surface, filling the tracks of animals imprinted during the summer and fall before. The winter was also important, when the snow would bring the land into full relief, and I would notice shapes that in other seasons I had overlooked. The Badlands were never the same, Lissa said. They were always slumping, folding in on themselves. The land would reveal what it wanted to us. The point was not to force the land to give up the body, but to be there when it did. Thanks so much. Really great to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Sierra. Incredible reading, and Sierra has to leave at 8, so she may not be able to take many questions. But I was struck just by the commonalities or the overlap, even a tenuous between your books. Emphasis sees on race, on shared geography, and really good writing that mixes history and personal story of immense particularity in all three cases. That seems clear. So I thought, as an initial question, how does one, the aspiring writer or the veteran writer, what are your thoughts on enlivening, hard fact or history, which of course is not hard fact? How do you think about folding in your research and making it fun and brilliant? Tough question maybe, but hopefully there's something there.
I vote Sierra goes first, and she's going to have to leave.
That was a great passing of that. Oh, this is not my strong suit, sort of breaking down my craft. But I mean, I research my book until I research my work, my essays, my articles, this book, pretty much until it's like spilling out of me. And I have way too much information. And so, when I sat down to write this book, I had such a profusion of information and so many different types of information. Like, I had, as I mentioned before, all these text message conversations that I was integrating as dialogue into the book. And then I had, I have this murder mystery and all these public records that I was using. But then, I really also wanted, as almost like an antidote to the darkness of the book, I really wanted to bring up in the landscape, which was so important to this story because Liz is constantly moving through it. And it's also, this process of searching is very healing for her. So I, as much as possible, I tried to find places where I could kind of like re-ground the reader in the landscape. And those ended up being, as you probably noticed in my reading, like some of the more lyrical sections. I can't really explain how I sort of created consistency between that and other sections of the book. Parts of the book do read more as investigative journalism, but I just tried to keep all of it within the story. And any time that I wanted to bring in sort of historical bits, especially sort of related to the tribe and where this like long history of violence comes in, and how this crime at the center of the book is sort of part of that legacy of violence. I tried to keep sort of the historical information within the story of Lissa and her family, so that it all sort of fit into the narrative. And I tried to find those places where, the history that I felt was essential for readers to understand, and the history that she was also sort of encountering or talking about, the places where those overlapped. Yeah.
That's great. Vanessa, Nicholas, what are your tricks?
You go ahead, Vanessa.
So, in this case, I'm writing fiction. I also write nonfiction, but I think that I'm a musician and I hear things sonically a lot. So I'm always listening for rhythm. So to me, history kind of has a voice to it that it shows up in a character. I mean, I've always studied history. I've always read history. And so when I sit down to start working with a character, and I set them on any piece of land in this country, there is already history everywhere in that moment. There are a million histories that are already there. So it's more of an act of like, what do I not pay attention to in the history and how do I bring it in? And with this novel in particular, the characters are not political themselves. They're political in the sense of sort of the feminist politic of their mother's life and anti-capitalist and all these other things, but they're not political in other senses. They're not active politically in the ways we would recognize, but they are forever on land that is that has history of stolen labor, of stolen land, of stolen labor, of every element and every layer. And yet they were born onto this without asking for any of that either, And so what I try to do with history is have the, the complexity of that one is never quite at ease without the other, right? Like that. So there's a shifting that has to come back and forth, and that tension. And for me, when I went into the editorial process with it, I mean, I had a lot of history in this. There is a lot of history in this book because it's about America. Like there's going to be a lot of history. It goes from Nantucket to Panama. I mean, there's a variety of things that are happening in this book about peak oil, about all sorts of things. And so, and there's a 19th century, ship in it, and, a whole bunch of stuff. So when I went through the editorial process, at one point, my editor said, on the historic, like some of those sections, it sounds like all history ruminating on itself. And I was like, yeah, that's what I wanted to do. He said it like a bad thing. He's like, we got to fix this problem of history ruminating on itself. So I guess the thing that I would add into that is that history is also character to me. So that sense of ruminating on itself, it's narrative ruminating on itself in my mind. And I realized that there were 2 or 3 ghosts. We started to call them ghosts. They're sort of apparitions within the book. And one is Walter Raleigh. And one is John A. Lejeune, who's a Marine who's involved in Panama and all sorts of other things, who was the son of a Confederate captain. And, I try to walk my characters and to walk history to the place of the greatest discomfort, and then also try to find the disturbing humanity within that moment. Because, I think it's my job as a fiction writer to walk into the place where there is no simple answer, to walk into the place where the questions just get bigger, and try to point at something that is hard to see. That's what I try to do anyway. So history is always a part of it.
Thanks, Vanessa. That was a fabulous answer. Nicholas.
Yeah, how to follow those answers are brilliant. Those readings are brilliant. Wow. Yeah, I guess thinking about, and I think it might be related to the last thing Vanessa said. Thinking about the way I thought about the relationship between kind of history and character, such as it is in this book. One thing I would start with is Baldwin himself, taught me so much about writing and about thinking and about seeing, just in the course of spending these years with him. And I love that the writer Sharifa Rhodes Pitts has this idea that if Baldwin was a basketball player and he had a signature move, we call it the Jimmy. And the Jimmy, Pitts says is this ability to go from the particular, like the really deep into the particular, out to the universal, back down to the particular in this extraordinary way. And as a reader, you sort of, are jolted into a new sense of reality. I think that's something Baldwin did so beautifully and brilliantly in so many, both his fiction and his nonfiction. So I think that's one thing that I think is crucial. And for Baldwin, that story of the particular to the universal, when he's thinking about human beings and their place in history and their relationship to history, right? History obsessed him, right? History is trapped inside of all this language he used. History is present in all that we do. And I think of Baldwin's, conception of what art is, right? And art for Baldwin is this creative confrontation, right? Creative confrontation with oneself, creative confrontation with others, creative confrontation with the world we occupy. And really, I think that when you think about how he wants us to engage history, it's this idea of a kind of creative confrontation, right? One needs to come to terms with one's history. That is Baldwin's, kind of central demand on us. And so I think that what I think is so powerful about the way he does that is when he is in that room, for example, with that principal. Yes, he's there with another human being and he wants to try to understand that human being, in his autonomy such as it is, but he also wants to understand that human being as a product of a particular history, and that his history is converging with Baldwin's history in this really dramatic way. And again, Baldwin wants to go from the details of that man's life to these big universal questions of how we treat each other. And so I think that's, just sort of one central thing. And then the last thing I'll say is just that I think the other thing that was kind of magical for me in telling this story was doing that with these two central characters and really weaving their lives. I mean, sort of like history is so disorienting in so many ways. And I was thinking about that idea of when you're losing balance of kind of finding that fixed point, to look at. And I think that with looking at this history of these two huge movements that are doing so much to change the country, having these kind of fixed points to look at through the eyes of Baldwin, through the eyes of Buckley, these radically different characters, and just watching, because they're so prolific as writers, I really had a peek into their minds every day, as they're helping shape this history. And so watching them think through the same set of facts in these radically different ways, although they are, just two individuals, doing that kind of thinking with them in slow motion, really in that chasm between them, right? I think there was a lot that I, as just somebody working on it, was able to see that I wouldn't have seen otherwise by putting this odd couple together. And so now I'm kind of obsessed with that, just sort of thinking about the space between, movements, the space between individuals, and kind of what we can learn in that space between, which I think is, obviously relevant to our current politics. So I'll shut up, but those are some thoughts.
No, that's great. I mean, I love thinking of the creative confrontation that your characters are undertaking, and that you have to undertake that too, to see through their eyes and try to inhabit their perspective. I want to give Sierra permission to leave us. She's got to get a start on early drive. But Sierra, thank you so much for reading, and congratulations on your recent Pulitzer finalist recognition. It's well deserved. It's a tremendous book, and I'm so glad for you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really great to meet you, Vanessa and Nicholas, and be here with all of you. And yeah, sorry I have to leave the discussion early, but yeah, this was really fun. So take care, everyone.
Thanks, Sierra. Are you two available to take a couple more questions? Thanks so much. Just as a follow-up, and I think Nicholas segues into it nicely. Both of your books, your recent books, come into being at a very volatile time in American history and our politics, and more generally. I'm curious, how the pressure of that, or just the fact of it, did it change the story in palpable ways? How was it an influence, or was it just the fact that you were writing it with these things surrounding it that?
I can jump in, or Nick, I don't want to. So I'll say that, like, my first novel, Zazen, which is actually going to come out again, which is going to be really weird. It's good, but it's getting reissued on Vintage this fall. It was a very, very political book. The narrator was extremely political. It was very overtly political. It was about political debates. It really, in some ways, prefigured a lot of the moment of where we're at now. And then when I started writing this book, which took me a long time to write, and the politics were getting more and more and more intense. And, it just felt constantly, Eric Garner, everything that was going on for just years and years and years between shootings and killings and police killings. And, just sort of like the onslaught doesn't stop. Raising a kid in the sort of Sandy Hook generation where it's just constant, along with that international politics, all of it. And it became really hard, I think, the last 5 or 6 years. It took me 8 years to write. Probably the last 4 or 5 years was a real struggle. And I put the book down multiple times because it wasn't overtly political in the same way Zazen was. And so I wondered, what am I writing this for? Why am I writing this story now? And it's interesting looking back. And, I really had friends who helped me stay the path on that, because I just, I'm also a union organizer. I'm also, I was like, I should be doing something else right now. Was a very hard pull for me. And in retrospect, it's interesting. it is in some ways a much more political book, but the characters aren't political. It's more that it's built into the world in a very different way. But I think that, like, I'm now glad that I wasn't so much on the train of that exact moment, because what I was really wrestling with was, where I think we've started to end up is like, what is American history here in this moment? How do we pass or not pass this on? Whose history? I mean, all of those have been there, but I feel like this is the weird thing. I feel like the readers for my book wouldn't have been there 5 or 6 years ago in the conversations of the last 5 or 6 years made the way I could write make sense now. So I had the opposite reaction of feeling like, wow, I'd just written something very specifically political, and then embarking on something that's like, why am I writing about a nautical, like, what I mean? It just felt so disconnected, and then it kind of all came back around.
That's great. So the novel just met the moment in its own serendipitous way, and through your particular vision. Love that.
Yeah, I that's really fascinating. I'm so excited to read these books. This Zazen sounds amazing, and yeah, I'm so excited to check it out. But yeah, and maybe I'll teach it in my politics in the arts class, and you can visit us, Vanessa. That would be cool. But yeah, I think so. With the Buckley Baldwin story, I mean, I started working on first an essay on the debate back in probably 2013, 2014, and doing really gearing up the research in 2015. And then really sat down to start, writing the book in January 2016. And so, yeah, I tell people, Nick, in response to the way you framed your question, like, definitely, I think my tone, obviously it underwent revisions once I was done with it. My tone by the time I started writing in January 2016 to when I was finishing up, which was after the 2016 election. My tone had, I think was kind of radicalized in some ways. I mean, but I think so. There was a sense in which, in terms of the cultural moment, I think that the book certainly was speaking to issues that were in the kind of becoming more urgent in the zeitgeist. But one of the things I always tell people is that the urgency of these issues, right, has always been there, especially for folks at the margins, and that's something that, of course, was central to Baldwin's vision of always thinking through these kind of big macro political questions and these big political moments, whether they be elections or court decisions or legislation. Baldwin was kind of always in that kind of prophetic mode, where even in the moments of apparent triumph, he was there to say, yes, but, right? He was there to say, yes, it's important that Johnson defeat Goldwater, but we need to think about how the life of a teenager in Harlem is really changing as a result of this, and really think about the world, the political world, the economic world, the social world through the eyes of folks at the margin. So I say all that to say that, yes, that like the urgency by the time the book came out, in October 2019, there was like kind of it seemed like the moment was certainly ripe in the broader culture for people to think about this story. And I think one of the things that happened to me that I think has been most powerful in the reaction to the book, such as it is that when I was on the road, talking to people about it, and then on Zoom and getting emails from people and that sort of thing, I would say like the kind of the reaction that I received the most of was like kind of a reader who is the kind of middle-aged to older white man who was writing to me or coming up to me at a talk to say they read the book, and it altered a little bit of the way they thought about race, and in particular, they had accepted a kind of story about Buckley, which is a story of redemption, that he had these horrible views in the 50s and 60s, and he came around by the end. I found the evidence didn't quite, justify that view, and although he's just this one individual, and I tried to be as fair to him as I could, I think that was that sort of telling this other story about him and thinking about him as a symbol for the country proved to be, I think, something that was powerful for some readers. And I felt like that kind of reaction was very gratifying, and I felt like I'm doing something that is political in a small way that I think is makes the world a slightly better place, maybe. And then also just reading, you know, for audiences where I interacted with folks who had not read Baldwin, right, and who had not really encountered Baldwin, and that the book kind of gave them a way into Baldwin, and then they wanted to read more Baldwin. That too is something that I think, you know, made me feel very, very good. And I think that Baldwin, of course, you know, he would often say that, you know, when people would point out the success of The Fire Next Time, he'd say a lot of people bought the book, but I think fewer of them read it, you know, and even fewer of them then acted on what message was. So you know, so I think it's important that these sort of things are being discussed and read, and then more importantly, that people are acting on the sort of messages and the sort of themes of the book and what they teach us about our responsibility in the present.
That's wonderful. I just to combine, if you have time for one more follow-up, I'll combine a couple questions that we've gotten in the Q&A, which is that you mentioned how the fire is upon us is about the power of language, and Susan asks, you know, could genuine dialogue, which there's a dialogue between Buckley and Baldwin, and then we're in dialogue with those characters as we read, could genuine dialogue be, and dialogue through books, be the answer or an answer to our trouble and divisions today? And Alex Ortega, who also asks in a similar vein, you know, Nicholas, you really had to humanize, or, you know, try to see from Buckley's perspective and sort of grow to like this character to some extent to make it believable and understandable, if that's fair. So my question is, you know, how do books, you know, create a dialogue? And maybe this covers some of the same territory you just did, but are books part of our solution in this day and age, or do we need something bigger?
Well, yeah, yes, I think books are part of the solution, and you know, but I you know, I don't want to go as much as I love books and I think books matter. I don't want to overstate the importance of books. I mean, part of the sort of reality that I've, you know, spending the time that I spent with Frederick Douglass, you know, and then the time I spent with Baldwin is in both cases, you know, I watched these two remarkable individuals who were so, I mean, words are their weapons, right? They are so masterful with language and using language to try to change the world. But I watched both these figures reach these points, you know, Douglass, especially in like 1860, right before the outbreak of the war, and then Baldwin really sort of later in the 60s, and kind of where I end up in The Fire is Upon Us, when these two individuals so devoted to language essentially both look at the world and say, it's, you know, it's all about power. and they sort of wonder, they have these moments where they're haunted by this idea that maybe language, maybe ideas don't matter as much as we want them to. I mean, in both cases, neither of them give up on words and give up on language, but I think that's something that's undeniable. I mean, I say that, you know, Baldwin's one of his only comments he made about Buckley after they have these two debates, he had the second debate with Buckley later in 65, Baldwin says that, you know, I sat there with Buckley and I tried to reason with him. I tried to do what Martin Luther King was doing. I tried to sort of appeal to his morality, but he is a bully and he refused to listen. And he says, what I should have done is hit him over the head with my coffee cup, right? And so Baldwin says that, and it was a joke, and you know, probably made the reporter laugh, but it was a joke that had a serious point at its core, which is what Baldwin says during the Cambridge debate. As he says, I worry that reason language will just lose its authority, right? And where reason ends, war begins, right? This is the idea of The Fire Next Time itself. So I think that's where it's sort of like, I think books matter insofar, and they matter, right? They matter no matter what. But one of the things they matter in the relationship to social change. I'm definitely curious to hear more from Vanessa about, you know, connecting the work she does in the world as an activist and words and language. So I'll just stop here. Is that Baldwin? One of the things I find really remarkable that I just actually heard recently, so it's been on my mind since long after the book came out, is Sam Tannenhouse, who is also devoted to books and words, has been writing a Buckley biography for like 20 years. And it's like over 2,000 pages now or something. And he says he's almost done. And one of the things I heard him interviewed about recently, and the thing that he said that really struck me was he said somebody had called Buckley the greatest conversationalist in history or something. And Tannenhouse says it wasn't he was a great conversationalist, he was a great listener. And I'm sitting there thinking about Baldwin's central indictment of Buckley is that he refused to listen. And here is Tannenhouse, who spent the last 2 decades with Buckley, identifying him as one of the world's great listeners. And so there again, the space between those two things, I think that there's something there, right? And that I think is really significant about this authority of language, that the authority that language has, the power that language has, in part depends on good faith attempts to hear what someone else is saying. And when they can't, when they refuse, that's when I think, language, reason ends and war begins, right? And it's a sad truth, but it seems like a real truth. And so I'll just stop there, and I'm definitely fascinated to hear what Vanessa has to say.
Vanessa, you're muted. That was great, Nicholas.
So I think about this a lot. In fact, I think about it and have thought about it most days of my adult life. And where I stand with it right now, because I've gone through periods where I thought, art means nothing, and have worked 85 hours a week in organizing and become a husk of a person. And then I've gone in other places where I think, okay, you can organize, you can do this, you can push, you can make change, but then you hit the point where it doesn't stick, right? We live, where the movements that come up don't get the traction they need to build into deeply entrenched changes. And then pendulum's already swinging back because it swings on the cultural lines, because it swings on language, And so I've had moments where so the question is, there are different tractions. And for somebody who is an artist and perhaps an organizer or in any other form, and any citizen who cares or gives a shit, you've got to be able to know, when something has attraction, that it begins to move of its own accord. And sometimes you're the person laying the tracks, right? And sometimes you're the person who gets to push the thing on the tracks. And sometimes the train's coming at you. It is a totally different set of things. But Baldwin is so interesting to me as well because, okay, so first off, I think that, television has changed this to some degree, but in general, for most people in most places, even the television that's doing it is doing it because they're hiring novelists, right? Like all the long form stuff in television is because they hired novelists. They stopped looking for people who wrote in television and they started hiring novelists from HBO on in the last 10 years. That's how they've done these series, right? The reason I mention that is it is through that kind of work of fiction that most people many times first come to emotionally imagine themselves in another world and another person or another place that is not their own. So for that essential seed of compassion, which you can easily criticize for all sorts of things and blindnesses, it is that personal moment in, and without that basic functional empathy that gets developed through story, there is we've all met people who match all our principles and are just the worst humans in the world and have no compassion or empathy at all. And they've got perfect politics, you know what I mean? Like, so there is this quality of what opens up your humanity. And I think Baldwin speaks to that in more than some of the most profound discussions of this subject come from Baldwin. When Baldwin is talking about Richard Wright, when Baldwin, you're shaking your head, when Baldwin is going through his, he is brutal on Native Son. There's different ways that he swings with it because his basic belief is that Richard Wright has denied, was it Bigger Vance? It's been a long time, denied him the humanity and the ability to transcend his expectations. I'm going to get the quote wrong, but okay. So basically his complaint was that he was too much of a communist and that his political agenda showed through in the book. And that because of that, he didn't allow his characters the possibility of change, that he denied, in Baldwin's words, please Nick, correct me, but something to the effect that he denied Bigger the the actual transcendence that he himself had experienced as a writer, coming from where he had come from. And that when you deny that level, that register, and you cut off the possibility to make that point, that there's something that's lost in that is such an extreme state. And he spoke so powerfully about the novel and the space of the novel. And so that's why I think that, and to me, he's one of those people who's always dealing with where does something have traction, and to be able to be in the moment where something moves forward and you say, ah, but yet, right? Not this moment. You know what I mean? Like that thing, it goes both ways, you know, it doesn't make you a great hit at parties a lot of times, but you know, it's to me, they're interchangeable. So I don't think, I think that dialogue, I am very afraid of fiction. There's a huge move in fiction to sanitize it, to make it politically. So, you know, I've seen this in a lot of things where the editors come in and they basically say, you know, we want to make sure that the reader knows that this is the character and not you. Can you add in this whole like, and it is just killing things because it doesn't open up hearts and it doesn't do anything. It's all about, frankly, virtue signaling. And I'm so sick of virtue signaling versus real change, you know, which is material. Real change has to be material, social, historical, you know, all elements of it. And sorry. So you shouldn't have asked me that question.
No, I thank you so much for fielding my convoluted hybrid questions so gracefully and with so much insight. I think that's a great note to end on for the night, and it gives us tons of food for thought that I'll be thinking about that for weeks and wondering about my own art. So thank you, Vanessa Veselka. And yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to say, I feel like since I paraphrased possibly incorrectly Baldwin and you're the Baldwin expert on this, Nick, do you want to weigh in on the point I made?
No, you got it exactly right. Yeah. So everybody's protest, everybody's protest novel is the one of the pieces where he kind of mostly is about Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harry Beecher Stowe, but then he kind of attacks Wright at the end, and then he writes about Wright a number of other times. Many Thousands Gone being the most, and yeah, you captured it really, really beautifully. I mean, Baldwin basically. Yes, of course, the character of Tom and the character of Bigger Thomas are so radically different, but Baldwin says in both cases, the author has sapped them of their humanity, so in the name of a political agenda. And I think this is where I think, and there's a lot of room for argument and debate about this, and I find it really, really fascinating the way Baldwin is sort of positioning himself in that moment where he's trying to say, he's simultaneously saying, like, we don't want our art to be overtaken by politics in that it hollows out our characters of their humanity, right? But at the same time, he wants he knows that art, he wants the art to be radical. He wants to be radical in terms of radicalizing our ability to see the world, right? This idea of seeing things we didn't see before and then changing how we live in the world as a result. So it's this deeply radical thing that he wants to sort of not be political in the wrong. He doesn't want to be political in the wrong way, right? So which is a tough thing. And just one last point about this related to the last point that Vanessa made, which I think is also really important. I was in a group discussion of Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man recently, and Ellison, Wright, Baldwin, they had this really interesting kind of back and forth in that period. And I sort of there were people in the conversation who were doing precisely what Vanessa just pointed out. So like people who were being, they were uncomfortable with some of the things in Invisible Man. And then one of the people asked me, so what did Baldwin think of Invisible Man? And it was actually the perfect response to the kind of person who wants to sanitize Invisible Man and say, I'm not really comfortable talking about that book anymore. I'm not really comfortable teaching that book anymore. And what Baldwin's response was perfect. And I wish Baldwin could be here to say it because he would be so much better at saying it than I can. But he said, look, Ralph Ellison means to be unsettling, right? You're not supposed to like all these characters. This book isn't supposed to make you feel good. In fact, just the opposite. And so it's certainly not something. And Baldwin says what you need to do is critically engage the text, right? And of course, you can offer a critique of Ellison. You can offer a critique of the characters in terms of how they fall short of your understanding of what morality requires. but don't avoid Ellison. It's a masterpiece, you know, Baldwin would say. And Ellison, one of the things he'd often do is sort of point out the ways in which he thought Ellison did some of the things that Wright did not do. And so anyway, that we could go. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. I definitely want to keep the conversation going with both of you. So let's keep in touch. And definitely, if folks had questions that we didn't get to answer, I'm easy to find. I'm Googleable. So you know, track me down, and I'd love to continue the conversation. And yeah, both of you need to come to my campus or Zoom into my campus. It'd be fun to have you and keep these conversations going.
You're not off the hook. We're going for another hour. I hate to break it. No. Such a pleasure to chat with both of you, Vanessa and Nicholas, and to Sierra, who we heard from earlier. Thank you so much for taking the time to read and answer our questions. Thanks to Jessica and LiteraryArts for facilitating tonight's program. Wonderful. And thanks to Devon for doing the IT in the background. We appreciate you, and everything went so smoothly. Thanks everyone for hanging in there tonight. A lot of great things said and spoken. Beautiful images. And take care, everyone. Have a great one, and see you in the fall.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Nick. Bye-bye.